morning, Leah.
You know, we were saying with my producer that there's this aura you carry. So when we see you, we feel happy. When you know Joy is coming on tomorrow, we are happy.
It is the glory of the Lord.
Well, Joy, you know, I want us to... Anyway, you always make me happy, Joy. But let's begin by a look at a story here. The Treasury talking about the Kenya Airways bailout. The Treasury Cabinet Secretary Tani has so far stated that he is keen on a long-term solution anchored in nationalization of the Kenya Airways. When we talk about nationalization of the Kenya Airways, what does that mean?
You will recall that initially, let's go back as far back as the initial East Africa community, then that just after independence, national airlines were taken as a matter of national pride. And so it was the community then that was in charge of ensuring that the East Africa Airways at that time was afloat. Then with the breakup of the East Africa community, Kenya Airways became the property of the Kenya government, as it were. And because of the structural adjustment programs and the economic experiments, let me just call them that, of the 1980s and the 1990s, there was this clamor to privatize national assets. And Kenya Airways is one of those that faced the chopping block, as it were. In that, there was a lot of private equity and private funding that came into Kenya Airways and for a while buoyed the airline. However, government still retained a stake in Kenya Airways, but we also had many other interests in Kenya Airways. So in recent past, what we have seen is because of the losses that Kenya Airways has been making, the corruption that we have seen in Kenya Airways, the way the carrier has been run, there was a very real threat that we're going to lose Kenya Airways altogether. And so the talk about renationalization started. All COVID has done, it has made us think about this conversation, I guess, a lot faster and a lot sooner than we would have before. Because in this particular situation, Kenya Airways is approximately 13 billion in the drink. That means before even COVID hit, they were already in trouble. Over 80% of their staff are either furloughed or up to 80% pay cuts. So you're looking at an airline that, even without COVID, was already in serious financial trouble. So when you listen to CS Yatani, what you understand, the sense of what he's talking about is, forget about us giving you a 7 billion shilling bailout to take you for the next 6 months. You need to have a strategy, or we need to have a strategy to ensure that this is not good money chasing after bad, that this is going to be an investment that will actually be able to turn Kenya Airways around. So there's a very strong team there. Kenya Airways is a very strong team. They're seasoned professionals who can be able to turn this thing around. But there's so much politics surrounding it. There's a lot of corruption that has gone on about it. There's plenty of contracts that were a bit dodgy with some of the leases, some of the fuel hedging. Now with COVID, we have the chance to renegotiate. So I'm really happy that the CS is looking at this in terms of the long term, rather than just saying, oh, we are too big to fail, throw some money at us, because that's the strategy that has gotten KQ where they are. They kept imagining they were too big to fail. Government has a stake in us. They're one of our largest stakeholders. They'll always bail us out. Moving forward, that cannot happen.
Joy,
but that said, this is across the globe. This is not a Kenya Airways problem right now. Most airlines, not most, all airlines actually have applied and required some government help, which is a loan that eventually will be repaid, but it's like a shot in the arm to get them back in the air again.
All right. You know, Joy, even as you talk about the fact that the CS is looking at it from a long-term perspective, I mean, remember that the national carrier needs money for maintenance of grounded planes. We have also issues there, payment of staff salaries and settlement of utility bills. Will this nationalization of the carrier help in addressing these issues? Talk about maintenance of grounded planes and whatnot.
That is what they're looking for, because the 7 billion that they're looking for immediately is to keep them afloat for the next 6 months while the airline industry normalizes. We are foreseeing a situation where, not even foreseeing, what we are seeing now is some of the airlines that are opening up some of their airspace a little bit. And some international travel has started happening. So we're seeing in the next maybe 2-3 months, it may come back up full force in terms of scheduling and availability of flights. What is doubtful is the uptake. How many people will actually be flying around? How many people actually still have the money to fly around? Because in terms of crisis, even if you had some money saved up for your Malta holiday, you'd rather keep that and see how long it will be before your own income stabilizes. So the recovery will be longer than 6 months. So even if you're looking for money to keep the lights on for the next 6 months, what's your plan for the next 6 months after the initial 6 months? And that's why I think the CS is coming in. This, in my opinion, would be a time also for government to negotiate that any money going into Kenya Airways right now needs to be equity. It cannot just be a loan or a grant. It must be we are buying more shares in the stocks. That the nationalization also happens as we go along, because Kenya Airways, as a Kenyan, a pride of Kenya, so to speak, is an important entity. But right now, 7 billion shillings, if you look at the president's recent economic stimulus, 7 billion is like half of what was allocated to agriculture, for example. I mean, you can't be that big that the entire of Kenya should just starve so that you can survive. So you need to give Kenyan people value for their money.
Let's look at the restrictions of movement into and out of 4 of the counties that are very key for, airlines. We talk about the Nairobi, Mombasa, Kwale, Kilifi counties. And this was basically, as we know, to curb the spread of the virus, which has hit very hard the Kenya Airways so far. Looking at these restrictions ongoing right now, we don't even know if they will be lifted eventually. If they persist, then what does it mean for the Kenya Airways?
If I listen correctly to the president, the last address that he gave us when he was announcing the stimulus package, he sounded like he was leaning more towards reopening the economy rather than further locking it down. If you look across the world, most people have started some return to normalcy. Domestic travel actually contributes a lot to the volume of business that Kenya Airways does. It's not a very big chunk, but it is something. It's not insignificant. There are many people, especially in Kenya today, many of the people who engage in air travel domestically do so for business purposes, for work. It's convenient. I can go to Mombasa in the morning, have my Matahad and Mombasa locals, come back home in the evening. I don't have to spend extra money or an extra night in Mombasa looking for accommodation. So many people would be happy to spend that money because it gives them convenience. Now, unfortunately for Kenya Airways, if the airspace is opened, there are locally, the local airlines as well, the no-frills carriers will also be open. So there's the issue also of competitiveness, because that is something that Kenya Airways has been struggling with in the domestic market and even regionally, as it were. So it would be a shot in the arm, but it would not be enough. The international travel is a lot more beneficial to them in terms of the bottom line.
Well, Joe, you know why I'm asking this question about if perhaps the restriction of movement persists. Look at what's happening right now. The World Health Organization has warned of the second peak of COVID-19. We do know that the WHO has also talked about, in this regard, the lifting of lockdown measures. The WHO is saying it is not advisable because right now we may be looking at the first wave of the virus, and there's potentially, according to WHO, another wave that might come later. So looking at what's happening and what the World Health Organization is saying, if indeed these restrictions persist, then what would it mean for for the Kenya Airways, considering that these counties may continue on a lockdown?
And I don't mean to downplay the science or to talk down on our doctors in any way. But in this particular instance, I think the medics have led us as far as they know how to lead us. Why do I say this? Is that we do not have enough information, even about, for example, an issue of a vaccine or an issue of treatment, for us to say, by the way, if we stay put for the next 5 months, for sure we'll have a vaccine and we can be able to reopen the economy. We cannot say that. Knowing how the world runs on people working, people generating income, people spending the income, then the economy rolls. And what we've seen in most countries in the world is that whereas we're happy to do the initial lockdown to help our health systems sort of catch up to speed with the pandemic, we are faced with the other dual reality that, by the way, if we lose our entire economy trying to stop the virus, we may come to a place where there are people who are alive, but they're dying of hunger. And that's why you find many communities where either it's the citizens pushing back, like what we have seen in the States, some of the United States of America, where some governors decided to just keep the economies open, or you find like what we are seeing with our neighbors in Tanzania, where they decide, you know what, let's just roll the dice. After all, who lives and who dies is actually a divine function. We cannot say whether we will keep people alive or people dead. So will there be a second peak? That's a medical problem. What I am seeing happening now is people weighing the economic problem as well. You don't want to create one major crisis while you're trying to avert another. So with the doctors knowing what they know so far, doing what they're doing so far, they're at a much better position right now in terms of knowing what is happening with COVID than we were in January. However, they don't have enough to tell us when COVID is going to come to an end. So if you look at, for example, HIV, if until now people had been told, don't have sex until we can find a vaccine for HIV, we would be facing extinction, wouldn't we? So there's some things where we have to say, okay, what do we know about it? How can we mitigate it? How do we move forward? But just face the reality of, you know what, this is our new normal. But at the same time, having to reopen the economy. So are we talking about a second peak? Possibly. Is it going to be really terrible? Possibly. One thing that we have seen in Africa, we have about 65,000 cases or even less of the total world infections. That tells us here, we might be able to afford to roll the dice. There's something about the African constitution, this now constitution being the constitution of our bodies, that is robust, that has somehow helped us to deal with this a lot better. And maybe God is merciful because he knows our medical systems are a lot more rudimentary than the ones in the West. So on this one, second peak, maybe, but are we willing to lock down until it passes? I don't think so.
Well, even before we go into that story about the second peak of COVID-19, I have one final question about the bailout of the Kenya Airways. When you look at the past, and I think you mentioned, you give us a little bit of history, talking about the financial troubles go beyond the corona-related woes. That's the financial troubles of the Kenya Airways. What should be done? Because these financial troubles have persisted for a couple of years. And when you talk about now the government saying they want to nationalize the Kenya Airways, do you think there's a possibility that these financial troubles will be addressed to, their totality?
Now, I'll not claim to know exactly how big the scope of what KQ is facing is, but let me give you just what I know from my observer status on the outside, what I read in the media. There are several things that were working against Kenya Airways. The last that I heard about it, they were leasing a lot of their aircrafts, and some of those contracts favored the lessor a lot more than it favored us. And so you need, for example, let's use a commonplace example. You need a matatu to play a route, but what you've negotiated with the guy who owns the matatu, you're making a lot of money but giving a lot of it back to him. So that was one problem. Another problem was something that airlines regularly do. It's called fuel hedging, where you sort of negotiate a price, looking at the trends, negotiate a price and hedge it. But that turned out to be a source of also hemorrhaging money because our hedges were too high. And so even though you are trying to keep the price predictable and stable, you are paying a lot more for it than even if we had waited for market forces, would never have gotten there. So those are just two of the examples that I can say off the bat. Oh, and that also the economic unrest that we saw with the staff members. They had plenty of staff who they had laid off. They had court cases that they are dealing with. So there are some obvious management issues that were going on. The other thing was spreading too far. Too many routes being opened and not enough traffic to sustain some of those routes. So some of these things is where the restructuring of KQ would have to start with. And with the current situation, it's an opportunity. It's let's say an excellent excuse. This is the dog ate my homework moment. We all get to do this paper again. So KQ has an opportunity to say, right, you use what in law we call the force of, it's like an act of God. start voiding some of those bad contracts. With what you know now, start looking for ways of renegotiating some of those deals. Okay. Some routes that were not profitable, this is an opportunity to just cancel them. Those that were profitable, this is an opportunity to boost them. See if we can have a better leverage on what KQ is doing, because the way they are going before, still, they are not going to break even, so to speak. So this is an opportunity to hit Control-Alt-Delete and start again.
Okay. Well, I just want us to go into this story. Just mention it slightly, because I know you've touched on it a little bit, Joy. The story about the World Health Organization warning of a second peak of COVID-19. Of course, we know so many of global economies. We're talking about also the African region. African countries want to open up their economies because this lockdown is really affecting trade and, you know, so many other things that are playing into the reopening of the economies. But look at what the WHO is saying. Lifting a lockdown, rather the lockdown measures, is not advisable at this moment. If then the lockdown persists, not just in Kenya, but even in the African region, what are we looking at as the status of even the global economy?
Like I said before, of the almost 5 million infections worldwide, Africa has 65,000. That's like a drop in the ocean. This is Africa-wide, not just Kenya. Africa-wide has 65,000. And I think it's even less than that. That tells me that African economies, for some reason, we've been spared the massive loss of life that we have seen across the globe. What we have not been spared, though, is the reality of what this means for our trade. So, for example, where we relied on a lot of export business, like with us with the horticulture, that has been affected. We had many Kenyans working abroad, some of whom have had to come back home, some of whom are now where they are and they cannot come back home. We have had those who are away for studies. So the global disruption has also become a local disruption, so to speak. So when you're talking about a second peak, what that tells me, again, is an opportunity for Africa to look inwards. Because for some reason, our numbers have still managed to stay fairly low. Maybe while the rest of the world is taking their time with an extra lockdown, this is an opportunity for us to have a mini lockdown, but work within Africa. We've been having a lot of talk about why it is Angolans will be eating rice that they've imported from Brazil. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to look at, can Ahero supply Angola? So in my opinion, is there a need for further lockdown? There are some places in the world where this thing has hit so hard that really they cannot think about reopening because of just what they've seen. With us here, I think it's a balancing act. Why am I saying that as well? Is because also our economies are run on a very rudimentary scale. Most of our people don't have a bank account. They don't have a savings plan. They don't have a mortgage. So the house they're living in is somebody else's house. Can we really afford to keep people locked down anymore? You get to a place where the hunger within becomes worse than the virus without.
Okay.
We don't want to come to a place where there is civil unrest. And so for Africa, the conversation goes a lot more than is there a second wave? It becomes a matter of survival. Can people really survive any more lockdown?
And Joy, even as we talk about the African region, let's look at this particular topic here. I want us to delve into COVID-19 impact on regional ties. We're looking at the heightening need for the East African states to work together, but yet we've seen frosty relationships between some of them. Talk about Rwanda and Uganda, talk about Tanzania and Kenya, their duel on trade barriers. And this doesn't look so good because it seems like the East African community has not really brought its efforts together to fight COVID-19 effectively.
We've seen the heads of state coming together to have a sort of discussion about it. Burundi and Tanzania are the ones who've sort of been a bit standoffish when it comes to the COVID-19 response because they have opted to go another route. They've opted to, this is God's work. Let him do what he will. Now, there are those of us who might think that this is complete and utter foolishness. But there are those who might think, you know what? They are a sovereign state. They can make up their minds to approach this, how they approach this. However, the reality of the matter is we are all joined at the hip. In fact, if it was not for the scramble and partition for Africa, we would not be several countries. We would still be one happy continent with several kingdoms in between. So I think this is an opportunity, and I think with what we saw with the Kenya-Tanzania dispute, at first it was very hard line, oh, you can't cross, you can't cross, you can't cross. It got to a place where the reality checked in, and there had to be a conversation where now they said, okay, moving forward, this is what we've agreed. In Tanzania, we're not announcing figures, so Kenyans, you do your testing, but don't announce figures. It was as simple as that. Okay, maybe not as simple, but as in a solution could be found. What we are seeing in Malaba right now is the same thing. The conversations must be had. At the end of the day, it is impossible for any one country in the East Africa region to imagine that they can isolate themselves completely from the others, because our borders are also very porous. It's not everybody who crosses into Kenya who comes in through the border posts. There are some places where the difference between Kenya and Tanzania is a river. Once you cross the river, you are across. So it's one of those conversations that must be had in the context of our culture.
All right,
but
Joy,
that said, it's also an opportunity for us to cross-pollinate. If we've got better health facilities, this is an opportunity to help our neighbors. If they've got more economic opportunities, there's an opportunity to also learn from them. And I think the president's tone the other day sounded like he was seeing some sense in what President Magufuli was doing in terms of allowing people to have some income and some latitude in this area. So,
well, Joy, I think the question now would be the fact that you're talking about perhaps African countries, and you've mentioned no African country can fight COVID-19 on its own without the help of its neighbors. And so the question would be then, how then can these African countries harmonize their response? Is there, a possibility that there could be a harmonization of response from African countries towards the fight against COVID-19?
One of the things I know we can do, for example, is in testing. So you remember, let's go back to the Kenya-Tanzania dispute. The tests in Tanzania would show one thing, the tests in Kenya would show another. What that tells you is not that the one is fake or one is not, it's that they are using two different tests. So one is an antibodies rapid test, another one is using the one that is looking for the virus itself in the system. Now, if, for example, the East Africa countries could all decide we are going to be using this standardized test and make that readily available in all our borders, then a certificate from Kenya can be acceptable across the border. Nobody has to keep testing over and over again for the virus. That is one. Then secondly, I think also the way our response to the virus has been with fear and trepidation because of what we've seen from the West. We have to learn from the West, because that's where it has taken and it's been full blown. China kept the information a lot under wraps, so we are learning from them, but more on a scientific level. But what people have seen of COVID is from the West. We have tried to say that in Africa, it has not quite happened. So I think time has also come for our own statisticians to tell us, in Africa, this is what we are dealing with. That would help us to also know, okay, is it safe for truck drivers to cross? And if they cross and they are positive, can we allow them into our communities? How do we handle them? Do we confiscate them? So such that the response is nuanced to the realities that we're dealing with today. Otherwise, we have to come to a realization where we are being told now, this thing might be here for a while. Let's work towards managing symptoms. Let's wait for a vaccine. Let's wait for a cure. But in the meantime, this is the regimen that we use to help our people stay healthy, even if they turn out positive. Because I think turning out positive seems to be a foregone conclusion. Eventually, it's like measles. It comes around, or chicken pox in a class. One of you got it, everybody gets it. But once everybody is done with a round of chicken pox,
well, Joy,
we have some immunity to move forward.
As we even talk about harmonization, your thoughts are very, they're an eye-opener. We do know, like we mentioned earlier on, the relationship between some of the African countries. How, in a nutshell and briefly, Joy, do we break these barriers that are causing some of the African countries not to work together and others not to welcome the united effort in their countries?
A lot of it, I think, has to do with capacity. So, for example, if you look at a country like Southern Sudan, who've got less than 10 ventilators in the entire nation, if they imagine COVID in their system, they're thinking this is just death to all our citizens. think about Burundi as well. Their medical systems are a lot worse than the rest of us. So some of them, it's a question of capacity. So if we can have an agreement and say, you know what, in Kenya we have capacity to handle X amount. My bed is, you know what they say, my castle is your castle. Tell our neighbors, you know what, in case this thing hits you, your people can come here for treatment. Your people can get some support here for treatment. Maybe some of that would be able to ease the tensions between the countries. Because if I know I cannot handle this thing if it comes into my society, I would rather keep all of you out, because if it comes, I don't know what I'll do with my people. But if my neighbor tells me, you know what, I got your back, maybe the cooperation would be easier. That's what I'm saying. The conversations have to be had, but more in terms of how can we work together to deal with this, rather than in Kenya I've got 10 cases, you guys have got 5. Before you make my 5, 10 like yours, stay at home. That won't work. We need each other.
Okay. Well, finally, I know my director tells me you don't have time, but I have to mention this story. Joy, Dubai's online shopping city. Dubai, always very innovative. One of those places I would love to travel to one day. But talk about a city for online shopping. And many have been forced to take their shopping habits online. And now we're talking about Dubai's online shopping city. Incredible, right?
Dubai is always on the cutting edge. And we saw that with their free port, where they said, you know what, us guys don't have much that we are using, but we've got a lot of space. Come and sell all your world wares here without any taxes. And that proved to be a stroke of genius. We've been pussyfooting about that idea with Mombasa becoming a free port. Now again, they lead the way. And they say, you know what, in terms of online shopping, guess what? We are still the world's preferred supermarket. It's a stroke of genius. Why? Because as you have said, with COVID, everything has moved online. We've gotten to a place where people have realized, oh, that meeting could have been a Zoom. People have realized that conference could have been done online as a webinar. We've come to a place where we've also realized, you know what, I can order something to my specifications and it can be delivered to my door. They're simply leveraging on the new normal. And for them, I must congratulate them, because as a country, they have made their entire economy thrive because of other people coming to spend money there. Now they've realized people may not be able to come to Dubai, but they're giving you the incentive to still shop in Dubai.
Talk about thinking ahead. Wow.
Not just thinking ahead. You know, I was Googling their site, and they've come to a place where even digitally, online, you can get a UAE, like a smart access. And it can enable you to access a range of services without ever leaving your country. And if you ever turn up in Dubai, you already have the persona to carry on. In the UAE, you already have the online persona to legally carry out a lot of functions. You know, it's the stuff of legend. Here we are still with e-citizen, and we feel like we're making strides. People have gotten to a place where people who are not their citizens can actually get legal identity to actually work, live and work and shop in their city. From wherever they are across the world. It's the stuff of genius.
We seem to have run out of time, but thank you so much, Joy, for always making time. It's always a pleasure. Do have a lovely day ahead.
Same to you. Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye-bye, Joy.
Bye.
Well, that has been a look at some of the stories making headlines, of course, locally, regionally, and globally. Then that was Joy Mdivo, an advocate of the High Court, basically helping us to understand